begin in the spring of 404 before Christ, on a road between a city and its harbour, watching men take a wall apart. The wall runs for 4 miles, two parallel lines of stone with a corridor between them, high enough that a man on top of one is out of range from the ground, wide enough on top for men to walk. It joins the city of Athens to the port of Piraeus, and while it stands, Athens cannot be starved, because whatever happens in the countryside, ships can come into the harbour and grain can walk up the corridor between those two walls and into the city, and no army on earth has a way to stop it. It has stood for about 70 years. It is the physical fact that made Athens what it was. And it is coming down, and it is coming down by hand, and the hands belong to Athenians. They have been given a deadline. The men working are their own citizens, doing it under supervision, and somebody has hired flute girls, and there is music playing while it happens, and the allied soldiers standing around watching are saying to each other that this is the first day of freedom for Greece. Stones are coming off the top course and going down into the corridor. The dust rises and hangs and drifts east on the wind off the water. There is a rhythm to it after a while, the way there is to any repeated work, and it goes on all day, and it will go on for weeks. Now hold that image, because I want to put another one next to it. 27 years earlier, in the winter, in a public cemetery outside the same city, a man stood up in front of the same people at the funeral of the first men to die in the war that ends with those flute girls, and he told them that their city was the school of Greece, that they were the only people who could be trusted with power because they used it generously, that they loved beauty without becoming soft and knowledge without becoming weak, that in Athens, a man who took no interest in public affairs was not regarded as harmlessly private, but as useless, and that these dead men had given their bodies to the community and taken in return a praise that does not grow old, and a tomb that is not the earth they lie in, but the memory of them in the minds of other people. That was the richest and most powerful city in the Greek world, talking about itself at the top of its confidence. And between those 2 days there is a road, and the road is what we are going to walk tonight. And here is the thing about it that I would like you to hold on to for the next 2 hours. Nobody conquered Athens into that. Not really. In the end, a fleet was lost, and a siege was endured, and terms were accepted. But the fleet went where it went, and the war was fought the way it was fought, and every single one of the decisions that got them there was voted for, in the open, on a hillside, by a show of hands, by 6,000 or 8,000 ordinary men standing on a slope of rock in the morning, who listened to speeches and made up their minds and put their hands in the air, and then went home and had dinner. Some of those votes were monstrous. Almost none of them seemed monstrous on the day. That is the difficult part, and it is the actual subject of this story. Now, about the man we are going to be leaning on. Most of what we know about the second half of this comes from Thucydides, who was an Athenian, and who was alive for all of it, and who was a general in it, and who was exiled by his own city for losing a town he was supposed to hold. He wrote the history of the war he had fought in and lost, from exile, and it is one of the 2 or 3 greatest works of history ever written. And I want to tell you the single most important thing about it before we start. He tells you he made up the speeches. He says it in his own introduction, plainly. He says that it was difficult to remember the exact words of what was said, both for him and for the people who reported things to him. And so he has written what he judged each speaker would have needed to say in the circumstances, keeping as closely as he could to the general sense of what was actually said. So the funeral speech I just paraphrased for you may be Pericles, and maybe Thucydides, the most famous passages of Athenian rhetoric that survive, the ones quoted in every book about democracy, are reconstructions by a man who was trying to be fair rather than transcriptions by a man who was taking notes. That does not make them worthless. It makes them a different thing than people usually think they are. And I would argue it is the reason he is great rather than a mark against him, because he could very easily have not told us, and nobody would ever have known. So, an honest historian with a grudge, a city that voted for everything that happened to it, and a wall coming down to the sound of a flute. Let us go back about 100 years and find out how it started. There is no hurry in this at all. Attica is a peninsula, and it is not good land. That is the first thing, and a surprising amount follows from it. The soil is thin and stony and dries out. There is not enough flat ground for grain at any scale. So Attica grows olives and vines and figs, which do well on poor slopes, and imports its bread. That single fact, a city that cannot feed itself from its own fields, determines Athenian foreign policy for 300 years, and it is why they end up caring so much about the sea routes to the north and the grain coming down from the Black Sea, and it is ultimately why the walls we just watched coming down had to exist. The second thing about Attica is that from almost anywhere in it you can see water, and that there is silver under the hills in the southeast. And the third thing is that it was never conquered. In the upheavals that ended the Bronze Age, when most of the Greek world burned and the palaces went down and writing was lost for 400 years, Attica came through comparatively intact. The Athenians made a great deal of this later. They claimed to be autochthonous, sprung from the soil itself, never having come from anywhere else, unlike everybody around them. It is not literally true. It was politically extremely useful. So, a poor, stony, unconquered peninsula, with silver in it, looking at the sea. For a long time, it was run the way everywhere was run, by aristocratic families who owned the good land and held the priesthoods and settled disputes among themselves. Law was whatever the noble families said it was, which meant it was different depending on who you were. The first attempt to fix that comes around 621, when a man called Draco is appointed to write the laws down. Writing them down is the point. Once they are on a board in public, they are the same for everybody, and a nobleman cannot invent a precedent in the afternoon. The trouble was the content. Draco's penalties were savage. Death for a very wide range of offences, including some quite small ones. A later Athenian joke, quoted by Plutarch, says the laws were written not in ink, but in blood. We get the word draconian from him, and it is one of the few Greek political terms that has kept its exact meaning for 2,500 years. The real work is done about a generation later by Solon, and Solon is one of the more remarkable figures in this whole story, mostly for what he refused to do. By about 594, Attica was close to civil war, and the cause was debt. Small farmers had borrowed against their land and against themselves. If the harvest failed and they could not pay, the creditor took the land. And if the debt was larger than the land, the creditor took the man and his wife and his children. Athenians were being sold abroad as slaves by other Athenians, legally, in numbers. Solon was given extraordinary powers to sort it out, and he did 4 things. He cancelled the debts, all of them outright, and had the marker stones that recorded the mortgages pulled out of the fields. He abolished debt slavery for citizens permanently. You could no longer pledge your own body as security for a loan, ever again. And he spent public money buying back Athenians who had already been sold overseas, and brought them home. And he says in one of his own poems that some of them had been gone so long that they no longer spoke Attic Greek. He reorganized political rights by wealth rather than by birth, which is not equality, but which broke the aristocratic monopoly, because wealth can be acquired and ancestry cannot. And he gave every citizen the right to bring a prosecution on behalf of somebody who had been wronged, not merely on his own behalf. That is a genuinely radical idea, and it is the seed of everything that follows. The notion that an injury to one member of the community is the business of any member of it. Then both sides came to him, wanting more. The poor wanted the land redistributed, which he had refused to do. The rich wanted the debts reinstated. And Solon, who had been handed effectively unlimited power by a city in crisis, and who could have kept it without much difficulty, wrote a poem about how everyone was annoyed with him, made the Athenians swear to leave his laws alone for 10 years, and then left the country for 10 years so that nobody could pressure him into amending anything. He went to Egypt and Cyprus, and according to a story that is chronologically impossible but too good to leave out, to the court of Croesus in Lydia, where he told the richest man in the world that he could not be called happy until he was safely dead. The laws did not hold. Within 30 years, Athens had a tyrant. The word needs handling, because it did not mean then what it means now. A tyrant in archaic Greece was simply a man who had taken sole power outside the constitutional arrangements. It carried no automatic implication of cruelty. Some of them were disastrous. Some were extremely good for their cities, and Pisistratus was one of those. He took power in Athens, was thrown out, came back, was thrown out again, and came back a third time on the second attempt, according to Herodotus, by driving into the city in a chariot beside an unusually tall woman dressed as the goddess Uthina, with heralds announcing that Uthina herself was bringing him home. Herodotus, who is not usually sniffy, calls this the silliest trick he has ever heard of, and notes that it worked. And then he ran the place well for 19 years. He kept Solon's laws and simply made sure his own people held the offices. He lent money to small farmers so they could buy tools and stock, which kept them on their land and out of the aristocratic clientage that had caused the crisis in the first place. He sent traveling judges out into the countryside so that people did not have to come to the city and stand in front of a nobleman to get a hearing. He built. He put on festivals. The city Dionysia grows under him, and that festival is where Greek tragedy comes from. He is quite possibly the reason we have Homer in a fixed text, because the tradition says it was under the Pisistrutids that the recitation of the Iliad and the Odyssey at the Panathenaic festival was regularized. The Athenians remembered him afterwards as a golden age and were embarrassed about that, because officially they hated tyranny. His sons were the problem. Hippias and Hipparchus inherited in 527, and it went acceptably for about 13 years, and then Hipparchus was murdered at a festival by two men called Harmodius and Aristogiton. Now the Athenians turned those two into the founding heroes of their democracy. They had bronze statues put up in the marketplace, among the first public statues of ordinary citizens anywhere, and there were drinking songs about them that everybody knew, and their descendants got free meals at public expense for generations. And Thucydides, who found this irritating, goes out of his way in the middle of his war history to stop and correct the record. He says the two of them were not political liberators at all. He says the whole thing arose out of a love affair and a personal insult, that Hipparchus had made advances to Harmodius, been rejected, and taken revenge by publicly humiliating Harmodius' sister at a religious procession, and that the killing was retaliation for that. And he notes that they killed the younger brother rather than the actual ruler, and that the result was not freedom, but 4 more years of Hippias becoming genuinely paranoid and unpleasant, because now he had a reason to be. The tyranny actually ended because a Spartan army marched in and removed Hippias in 510, at the request of an exiled Athenian family and the encouragement of the oracle at Delphi, which that family had been extremely generous to. So, Athenian democracy was founded on a murder that was probably about sex, and delivered by a Spartan invasion. Which brings us to the man who actually built it, and who almost nobody has heard of. His name was Cleisthenes. In the confusion after Hippias left, two aristocrats were competing for control in the old way, by assembling factions. Cleisthenes was losing, and so he did something that Herodotus describes, rather beautifully, as taking the people into his party. He went over the heads of the aristocracy and offered the ordinary citizens something nobody had ever offered them. What he proposed, and what was enacted in 508 and 507, was not a tidying up. It was a reconstruction of Athenian society from the ground, and the mechanism is so strange and so clever that I want to go through it slowly. The problem he was solving is that politics ran on kinship and region. If you were from the coast, you voted with the coastal families. If you were from the plain, the great landowners of the plain expected your support. Four ancient tribes organized everybody by descent, and the noble families controlled them. So he abolished the significance of all of it by inventing new units that cut across every existing loyalty on purpose. He divided Attica into about 140 small local units called demes, villages, or neighborhoods in the city. The deme became the thing that mattered. You were registered in your deme kept the citizen list, and from then on an Athenian was formally identified not by his father's family, but by his deme. That is a genuine change in what a person is, and it was made permanent by making it the name people wrote down. Then he grouped the demes into three regional blocks, the city, the coast, and the inland, and created 10 new tribes, and each new tribe was made up of demes from all three blocks, deliberately, so that every tribe contained coastal fishermen and inland farmers and city craftsmen, and no tribe could vote as a regional block, and no aristocratic family could deliver a tribe. It is gerrymandering in reverse. It is districting designed specifically to break the existing power blocks rather than to preserve them, and it worked for 200 years. And on top of that structure, he put the council of 500, 50 men from each of the 10 tribes, and here is the crucial part: chosen by lot, not elected, drawn. Any citizen over 30 could put his name forward, and the names were drawn, and you served for 1 year, and you could do it twice in your life and no more. The council prepared the business for the assembly, and each tribe's 50 men took a turn as the standing committee for a 10th of the year, living in a round building in the marketplace, on duty day and night, with a third of them sleeping there so that there was always someone awake who could act on behalf of the state. Which means that over the course of a normal Athenian lifetime, an enormous proportion of the citizen body, the estimates run to something like a third or more, spent a year of their life actually running the government, not voting for someone who ran it, running it. Farmers, potters, oarsmen, men who could barely write, taking their turn at the machinery. That is the thing that is genuinely hard for us to imagine, and it is worth pausing on before we go on, because everything that happens for the rest of this video comes out of it. You are on a hillside called the Peninsula, just west of the Acropolis, and it is early before the heat. It is not a building. It is a slope of rock, cut and leveled into a fan shape, facing down towards a low platform of stone. There are no seats. Men sit on the ground and on the rock. You came up in the dark, and there is dew still on the stone, and you can feel the cold of it through your cloak. There are 6,000 men here, perhaps 8. The slope fills from the bottom, and the noise as it fills is not a crowd noise yet. It is hundreds of separate conversations, and the sound of it changes as it gets denser, the way rain changes when it gets heavier. You can see the whole of the Acropolis from here, and the smoke of the morning fires below, and beyond it all at the edge, the sea. There is a platform down there, and any one of the men on this hill is entitled to stand on it. That is not a figure of speech. The herald will open the meeting by asking, out loud, who wishes to speak. The question is put to the whole hillside, and it is a real question, and an unknown man can walk down and answer it. Most do not. Most never say a word in their lives, and listen and vote. But the right is not theoretical, and the men who do speak have to stand on a rock in front of everyone they know and be shouted at if the room turns. Nobody is in charge here. That is the part to sit with. There is no president, no king, no permanent chairman. The man presiding today was drawn by lot this morning, and will never do it again. There is no government sitting on a bench waiting to reply. There is a hillside of farmers and shopkeepers and rowers, and an agenda, and by lunchtime they will have decided what a state does. They will decide, on days like this, to build a fleet, to go to war, to kill the population of a city, and once to unkill it. Hold that hillside in your head. We are going to come back to it a great deal. 18 years after Cleisthenes, the Persians came. I am going to move through the Persian wars fairly briskly, because they are the best known part of this story, and because the Athenian angle is what matters here. But there is one moment in them that decides everything else, and it is not a battle. In 490, a Persian force landed at Marathon, on the coast of Attica, about 25 miles from the city. The Athenians marched out to meet it with about 9,000 men, plus 1,000 from Plataea, a small city that had been an ally for years, and that sent everything it had. They sent a professional runner to Sparta to ask for help. He covered something like 140 miles of mountain road in 2 days, which is a far more extraordinary feat than the race that is named after this battle. And the Spartans told him that they could not march until the moon was full for religious reasons, and would come afterwards. They did come. They arrived the day after it was over, and walked the battlefield, and admired the work. The Athenians attacked. They thinned their own center, and strengthened both wings, and ran the last stretch to close the ground quickly under archery. The center gave way, which was the plan, or at least became the plan, and the two wings held and turned inwards, and closed on the Persian center from both sides. The Persians broke and ran for their ships, and were cut down at the water and in the marsh behind the beach. The Athenians lost, by their own count, 192 men, and they knew exactly who they were, and they buried them in a mound on the battlefield instead of bringing them home, which was an extraordinary honor, and the mound is still there, and you can walk up it. Marathon mattered enormously to the Athenians. For the next 2 generations, to have fought at Marathon was the highest claim a man could make. The playwright Aeschylus wrote 7 plays that survive, several of them among the greatest ever written, and the epitaph he composed for himself does not mention that he was a playwright at all. It mentions that he fought at Marathon. But the moment I actually want is 7 years later, and it happens on that hillside. In 483, the state silver mines at Laurion, in the southeast of Attica, hit a very rich new seam. A windfall arriving all at once, belonging to the state, which meant belonging to the citizens. The proposal in front of the assembly was to distribute it, 10 drachmas each, to every citizen, which was something like 2 weeks' wages for a working man, a real amount of money arriving in the hands of people who mostly did not have much. And a politician called Themistocles stood up and argued that they should not take it, and should instead spend all of it on building 200 warships. Think about what that requires. You are asking several thousand men, most of whom work with their hands, to vote to take money out of their own pockets and put it into a fleet against a threat that has not arrived, 7 years after the last Persian attack was seen off by infantry. Herodotus says he did not even use the Persians as the argument. He used Ugina, a rival island close by that Athens was actually feuding with at the time, because that was a threat people could see. Whether that is true or whether it is a story told afterwards to make him look clever, the vote went his way. And I want to be honest about where that silver came from, because this is the foundation of Athenian greatness, and it should not be laundered. The mines at Laurion were worked by slaves, not household slaves, not craftsmen, a separate category of labor, in numbers that ran to many thousands, working galleries cut into the rock that were often less than 3 feet high, so that the work was done lying down or crouched, by lamplight, in air that had to be dragged down from the surface through shafts. The ore was hauled out and crushed and washed in works on the surface. The mines were state property and were leased out to private contractors, and the contractors hired slaves in gangs from men who owned them and rented them out. And there is a surviving speech in which the profitability of doing this is discussed in exactly the tone you would use about renting out a cart. Life expectancy in those galleries was not good, and nobody kept a record of it because nobody was counting. The fleet that saved Greek freedom was paid for out of that. Both of those things are true, and neither cancels the other, and I am not going to tell you how to weigh them. In 480 Xerxes came, with the largest army anyone had ever assembled, and the Greek allies chose to hold the pass at Thermopylae and lost it, and after that there was nothing between the Persian army and Athens. And the Athenians did something almost no city in history has done. They left. There is a stone that records it. It was found in 1959, built into a wall in the town of Treason across the water, and it purports to be the text of the evacuation decree, the whole city to be entrusted to Uthina, women and children to be sent to Treason and Salamis and Ugina, the old men and the movable property to Salamis, and every able-bodied man to board the ships. Scholars argue about whether it is a genuine copy of the original or a 4th century reconstruction, and that argument is not settled, and it is worth flagging. What is not in doubt is that the evacuation happened. They emptied a city. Everything they could carry went onto boats, and Herodotus adds a detail that does more work than any speech. The dogs. He says the dogs, unable to be taken, swam out after the boats, and that one of them swam all the way across the strait to Salamis behind its owner's ship and came ashore and died there, and that they showed visitors the place. A small garrison stayed on the Acropolis, either because they were too old to leave or because they had decided that the oracle's advice about a wooden wall meant the old wooden palisade up there rather than the ships. They were killed. The temples were burned. The Persians took Athens and looted it and set fire to it, and the people watched from the water. You are on a boat off Salamis, and you can see it happening. You are close enough to make out which quarter is going up, and the wind is bringing it across, and the light on the water at dusk is coming off your own city. You can identify streets by the smoke. You know the shape of the rock, and where your house sits in relation to it, and you can see the exact place. There is nothing you can do about any of it, and you are going to be here all night. And around you on this boat, and the next one, there are your neighbors doing the same arithmetic. Somebody near you says something about rebuilding it, and nobody answers. Then Salamis, in the Narrows, in September. The Greek fleet was under overall Spartan command, and this is one of those details that gets quietly dropped from the Athenian version and from most modern ones. Athens supplied more than half the ships. Sparta supplied the admiral because Sparta led the alliance, and Athens accepted that because the alliance would have fallen apart otherwise. Themistocles argued for fighting in the strait, because the Persian fleet was larger and better handled, and would lose all of that in a channel where it could not maneuver. He is said to have sent a secret message to Xerxes, telling him the Greeks were about to break up and run, so that the Persians would block the exits and force the battle he wanted. Xerxes blocked the exits. In the morning, the Greeks came out into the channel, and the Persian fleet came in after them, in column, into water too narrow to deploy, with a swell running, and the rear ranks pushing the front ranks into the wreckage of the front ranks. Xerxes watched from a chair on the hillside opposite. We know that because 8 years later Aeschylus put it in a play in Athens, in front of an audience that had been there, and told the story from the Persian side, in the voices of Persian elders and the mother of the Persian king grieving for what had happened to them. The following summer the land army was destroyed at Plataea, and on the same day, so the tradition holds, the remains of the fleet were beaten at Mycale on the far coast. And it was over. And the Athenians came home to a city that had been burned to the ground, and they rebuilt it. And they made one decision about the rebuilding that I want to end this chapter on. They left the temples on the Acropolis as they were. Ruined, burned, column drums cracked and blackened, statues broken. They did not clear it, and they did not restore it. There was said to be an oath, sworn by the allies before Plataea, that the sanctuaries burned by the Persians would be left in their ruined state as a memorial. Whether or not the oath is genuine, and it is disputed, the ruins stayed there, in the middle of a rebuilt and rapidly enriching city, for more than 30 years. Every citizen walking through the marketplace looked up at a burned hill every day for a generation. They built the walls first, in a hurry, using whatever was to hand, and if you go and look at the base of the north wall of the Acropolis now you can see it. Column drums from the burned temple laid on their sides in a row, built into the fortification, deliberately visible from the city below. They were not hiding the damage. They were displaying it. What happens next is the part of Athenian history that people find hardest to look at directly, and it takes about 30 years, and almost nobody in it is doing anything obviously wrong on the day they do it. The Persians had been beaten, but not removed. There were still Persian garrisons on the coast of Asia Minor, and the Greek cities of that coast and the islands had every reason to think Persia would come back. Sparta, which had led the alliance, did not want the job. Sparta's power was based on a land army and on holding down an enslaved population at home, and long naval campaigns overseas were the last thing it needed. Its commander on the spot behaved so badly that the allies asked him to leave. So in 478, the Greek states of the Aegean formed a new alliance and asked Athens to lead it, and Athens agreed. It was called the Delian League because the treasury was on Delos, a small sacred island in the middle of the Aegean that belonged to nobody. Every member state swore the same oath and threw lumps of iron into the sea to hold until the iron floated. Members contributed either ships or money, at an assessment worked out by an Athenian named Aristides, who had a reputation for fairness so solid that the assessment was accepted without much argument, and he was known ever afterwards as Aristides the Just. It was voluntary. It was defensive. It was aimed at a real threat, and it had one structural feature that turned out to be fatal, and nobody noticed it for about 15 years. Members could pay in ships or in cash. Now, if you are a small island with a few thousand people, keeping a warship at sea is a nightmare. A trireme needs 170 rowers and a crew of about 30 more, all of whom need feeding and paying for every day they are away. And it needs to be hauled out and dried and maintained, and it is the single most expensive object your community owns. Paying money is enormously easier. You send silver, and the alliance is defended, and your men stay home and work. Almost everybody took the cash option, and every year that a member paid cash instead of sending ships, Athens built the ship instead, and the ship was Athenian, and the crew was Athenian and got paid, and the skill stayed in Athens. Within a generation, the alliance had one navy, and it belonged to one member. You can watch the conversion happen in 3 episodes, and Thucydides lays them out one after another because he wants you to see it too. Naxos tried to leave sometime in the 70s. The League besieged it and brought it back in by force. Thucydides notes, in one of his flattest and most chilling asides, that this was the first allied city to be enslaved contrary to the established rule, and that afterwards it happened to the others as their turns came. Thasos, in 465, is the one that removes any doubt. Thasos was a wealthy island with gold mines on the mainland opposite and a trading post there, and the dispute was not about Persia at all. Athens wanted the mines and the trade. Thasos objected and left the alliance. Athens besieged it for 2 years, took it, pulled down its walls, confiscated its fleet, took the mainland possessions and the mines, and imposed an indemnity and annual tribute. That is not a defensive alliance disciplining a member. That is an empire taking assets. And then in 454, the treasury was moved from Delos to Athens. The official reason was security. The Persians were active. Delos was exposed. The money would be safer behind the walls of a great city. It is not an unreasonable argument. It also meant that the accumulated cash of every state in the alliance was now inside Athens, under Athenian control, and that the sum owed each year by each member was paid at Athens into Athenian hands. And 1/60th of every payment was set aside as a first fruits offering to Athena, and because it was an offering to the goddess, it had to be publicly accounted for on stone. Those stones survive, fragments of them in enormous quantity, reconstructed over decades of scholarship into what are called the Athenian tribute lists, column after column of place names and quantities, year by year, for decades. You can read them. You can see cities appear and disappear. You can see assessments go up after a revolt. You can watch, in the arithmetic, an alliance become a revenue stream. Then the rest follows, quickly and without anybody voting for it as a package. Allied states were required to use Athenian coinage, Athenian weights, and Athenian measures, and to close their own mints. Serious legal cases involving allies were transferred to Athenian courts, which meant an islander with a grievance had to sail to Athens and stand in front of an Athenian jury of several hundred men to have it heard. Garrisons were placed in some cities. Athenian officials were installed to oversee others, and in places that had rebelled, land was confiscated and settled with Athenian citizens, who kept their Athenian citizenship and who functioned, whatever the official description, as a garrison with farms. You are a delegate from an island, and you have come up from the harbor carrying your city's payment, and you are queuing. There are men here from 30 places, holding the same kind of box you are, and you know some of them by sight now because you come every year. The queue moves slowly. There is a clerk with a list, and behind him a scribe, and the amounts are being called out and checked against the assessment, and then written down. This used to be your alliance. You remember the oath, or your father does. Some of the men in this queue have fathers who rode at Salamis in their own ships. And what you are looking at over the heads of the queue is a hill covered in scaffolding, because they are building something enormous up there, and everyone knows what it is being paid for with, and nobody in this queue is going to say it out loud. There is one more thing that happens in these years, and it is the most radical single act in the history of Athenian democracy, and it ends with a murder. The old aristocratic council, the Areopagus, made up of former senior magistrates who served on it for life, had retained a general oversight of the state, a guardianship of the laws, ill-defined and therefore powerful. In 462, a politician called Ephialtes stripped it of everything except jurisdiction over homicide and a few religious matters, and moved its powers to the Council of 500, the Assembly, and the popular courts. In one set of measures, the last institutional check held by the old families was removed and handed to bodies made up of ordinary citizens chosen by lot. Shortly afterwards, Ephialtes was murdered. Nobody was ever convicted. The sources are vague and mutually inconsistent, which is itself informative. He was killed at the height of his influence, immediately after the most damaging reform ever inflicted on the Athenian aristocracy, and the case went nowhere. His younger colleague took over the leadership of the popular party and held it, in effect, for the next 30 years. His name was Pericles. Pericles is a strange man to build a chapter around, because almost nothing about him is warm. He was an aristocrat by birth, from one of the 2 or 3 grandest families in Athens, and he spent his entire career as the leader of the popular party against people exactly like himself. He was elected general 15 years running at the end, and something like 30 times in total, which was the only office that mattered because it was the only important one that was still elected rather than drawn by lot. He never held a permanent position of any kind. His power was entirely a matter of the assembly listening to him every time for 30 years. The personal details that survive are mostly about distance. He was said never to walk any road in Athens, except the one to the marketplace and the council chamber. He turned down dinner invitations, all of them, for years, so consistently that when he finally went to a family wedding, he left before the drinking started. He was not a good speaker, in the sense of being exciting. Contemporaries describe him as formal, controlled, and slow, and Thucydides gives a slightly frightening description of the effect, that when the people were overconfident, he would say something that frightened them, and when they were frightened, he would restore their confidence. The comic poets, who could say absolutely anything about anybody on a public stage, during a religious festival paid for by the state, went after him constantly. Their favorite target was the shape of his head, which was apparently long and narrow, and they called him Squill Head and Onion Head, and joked that this was why he was never sculpted without a helmet on. Look at any bust of Pericles, and you will notice that he is wearing a helmet pushed back on his head. That is not because he was a soldier. That is a 2,500-year-old attempt to avoid a joke. He did 2 things that made the democracy real rather than theoretical, and one of them is unglamorous and is the more important of the 2. He introduced pay for public service. Before this, you could sit on a jury or serve on the council, and it cost you a day's earnings, which meant, in practice, that the men who did it were the men who could afford to lose a day, the comfortable and the old. The right was universal, and the exercise of it was not. Pericles put a small daily payment on jury service, and later on the council and other offices. 2 obols at first, later 3. It was not generous. It was roughly what an unskilled man could earn in a day, sometimes slightly less, and it was designed to make participation possible rather than profitable. There is a surviving pamphlet from these years by an anonymous author usually called the Old Oligarch, and it is one of the most useful documents in Greek history because it is written by someone who despises the democracy and who explains exactly how it works in the course of complaining about it. He says with enormous distaste that everywhere in Athens the poor and the ordinary get more than the noble and the rich, and that this is not a mistake, but the deliberate design of the system, and that it is precisely because of this that the democracy survives. He is right about all of it. He simply wants his readers to be appalled. The other thing Pericles did in these years is less admirable, and it is worth putting straight next to the pay, because they are 2 halves of the same idea. In 451, he carried a law restricting Athenian citizenship to men with an Athenian father and an Athenian mother. Previously, the father had been enough, and aristocratic families had for generations married advantageously into other cities. The effect was to close the citizen body. It halved it on some estimates. Men who had been citizens all their lives found that their sons were not. Mixed marriages that had been perfectly respectable produced children who were now legally foreigners in the city they were born in. And it tells you something true about this democracy that we tend to skate past. The Athenians did not think of citizenship as a set of principles that anybody could subscribe to. They thought of it as a hereditary property with a fixed number of shares in it, and the more valuable the shares became, and with an empire paying tribute they were becoming very valuable, the more sense it made to stop issuing them. The irony arrived 20 years later, personally, and the Athenians enjoyed it. Both of Pericles' legitimate sons died in the plague. The only son he had left was by Aspasia, who was from Miletus, which meant the boy was not a citizen under his own father's law, and Pericles had to stand up in front of the assembly and ask for an exemption for his own child. They gave it to him. Plutarch says he wept while asking, which is the only time in the entire record that anybody reports him showing an emotion in public. Aspasia deserves more than a footnote. She was a metic, a resident foreigner, which meant she could not vote, could not own land, could not appear in the assembly, and had to have a citizen sponsor to conduct legal business. She was also, by every account we have, the most interesting person in the room in a city full of interesting people. Her house was where Socrates went to argue, and he is reported as saying he learned rhetoric from her. Plato has him credit her, half-jokingly, with writing the funeral oration itself. The comic poets attacked her viciously and obscenely, which is how we know she mattered, because they did not waste material on people who did not. Almost everything hostile said about her comes from men whose job was to be funny at a festival, and later writers took the jokes as evidence and repeated them as fact. And that is roughly how the reputation of the most educated woman in classical Athens was assembled. And then there is the hill. For 30 years, the temples on the Acropolis had stood burned. In 447, the Athenians began to build, and what they built in the following 15 years is the reason people still go there. The Parthenon took 9 years for the building, and another 6 for the sculpture. It is not a large building by the standards of empires, and it is not tall. What it is precise, and the precision is genuinely strange when you learn about it. There are almost no straight lines in it. The floor is not flat. It rises slightly towards the center, by about 11 centimeters on the long sides, so that the whole platform is a very shallow dome. The columns are not vertical. They lean inwards, and if you continued their lines upward, they would meet somewhere over a mile above the building. They are not the same thickness top to bottom either. Each one swells slightly about a third of the way up. The corner columns are thicker than the others and set closer to their neighbors, because a column seen against open sky looks thinner than one seen against a solid background, and they corrected for it. The usual explanation is that all of this compensates for optical distortion, so that the building appears perfectly regular when it is in fact not regular anywhere. That explanation goes back to antiquity. Some modern scholars think the curvature is more practical than aesthetic and served to shed rainwater. Both may be true. What is not in dispute is that every block was cut individually, that there is essentially no repetition, and that they did all of this without mortar, fitting the marble so closely that the joints are difficult to see. Inside stood the statue, about 11.5 meters tall, wooden core, ivory for the flesh, and something over 1,000 kilograms of gold for the clothing, and the gold was made removable in plates, deliberately, so that it could be taken off and weighed. It was not only a religious object, it was the reserve. The whole program was paid for out of the tribute, and this was said out loud at the time, and there was a serious political fight about it. Plutarch preserves the accusation that Greece was being insulted and tyrannized openly, seeing that with the money contributed for the war it was being gilded and beautified like a vain woman, decked out in precious stones and statues and 1,000-talent temples. And Pericles' answer, as Plutarch gives it, is not a denial. It is that Athens was not obliged to give an account of the money to the allies, because Athens was doing the job it had been paid for. The allies were defended. No Persian was troubling them, and that what was left over after the defending was Athens' business. That is the empire admitting what it is, in the assembly, and winning the vote. There is one more document, and it is my favorite thing in the entire Athenian record. The accounts for the Eurycthean, the smaller and stranger temple on the north side of the hill, survive on stone. They are ordinary state building accounts, listing what was paid to whom for what work, and they were carved because public money had been spent and had to be accounted for. And they list the workers, and beside the names they list the status: citizen, metic, slave. They are working side by side. Sawyers, masons, carpenters, painters, gilders, men fluting the columns. A citizen and a slave working on adjacent column drums appear on adjacent lines. And they are being paid the same daily rate, 1 drachma a day, for the same job, regardless of status. Now be careful with that, because it is beautiful and it is not what it looks like. The slave's drachma did not go to the slave. It went to his owner, who had contracted him out, and who might allow him to keep a portion. The equality is in the price of the labor, not in the position of the laborer. A slave working on the Acropolis was still a slave and could still be sold in the afternoon. But there they are named on stone on a public monument in the accounts of the most beautiful building in the world. A free man, a foreigner, and a slave doing the same work for the same money, and all three names carved because the state had to show where the money went. Athens at its height is both of those things at once, and it never resolved it, and it never tried to. The war that ends all of this begins in 431, and it does not begin with an invasion or an ultimatum. It begins with a series of local disputes that any reasonable person would have thought were manageable. There was a quarrel between Corinth and Corcyra, a former colony of hers, over a third city further up the coast. Corcyra had a large fleet and had been neutral for years, and now needed help and came to Athens. Athens debated it for 2 days and decided to make a defensive alliance, not an offensive one, deliberately limited, precisely in order to avoid breaking the existing peace treaty. Corinth was an ally of Sparta and was furious. Then Athens told Potidæa, a city in the north that was a tribute-paying member of the Athenian Empire, but also an old Corinthian colony, to pull down part of its walls and send away its Corinthian magistrates. Potidæa revolted. Corinth sent volunteers. Athens besieged it. Then Athens passed a decree excluding Megara, a small neighbor that had gone over to Sparta, from every market and harbor in the Athenian Empire. It was not a military act. It was an economic blockade, and for a small state that lived on trade, it was ruinous. And Sparta called a congress of its allies, and the allies made their complaints, and the Spartans voted that the treaty had been broken. Thucydides, having laid all of this out in detail, then tells you that none of it was the reason. He says the truest cause, and the one least openly stated, was that the growth of Athenian power frightened the Spartans and made war inevitable. That sentence has been quoted and used and misused for 2,500 years. It has been applied to Germany and Britain, to America and the Soviet Union, and lately to China. It is worth noticing that Thucydides is making a claim about what people were afraid of, not a law of nature, and that his own narrative shows a dozen points at which a different vote in a particular room would have produced a different decade. Pericles' strategy was radical, and it was correct, and it destroyed the city. His argument was arithmetic. Sparta had the best infantry in the world, and Athens could not beat it in a field. Athens had the fleet, the walls, and the money, and Sparta had almost no reserve of cash at all. So, do not fight them on land. Bring everybody inside the walls. Let them come into Attica and burn the farms. Supply the city by sea, which they cannot stop. Raid their coast from ships, which they cannot prevent. Concede nothing, add nothing, and wait, because they cannot keep an army in the field indefinitely, and we can keep ships at sea for as long as the money holds. It would probably have worked. It required the entire rural population of Attica to abandon their land and their houses and their family shrines and their ancestral graves and move into the city, and to sit inside the walls and watch smoke rising off their own fields, and to do that repeatedly for years without breaking. Thucydides says the move was hard for them because most Athenians had always lived in the country. They brought the woodwork of their houses with them. A few had relatives in the city, most did not. They occupied the empty spaces and the sanctuaries, and then the towers of the walls, and then the strip of ground between the long walls, and eventually the space around the Acropolis that was under a religious prohibition and was not supposed to be lived in at all, and they lived there anyway. The Spartans came in the first summer and burned the countryside, and the Athenians stood on the walls and watched, and there was very nearly a riot when the burning reached the deme where Pericles himself owned land and his estate was conspicuously left untouched, which was almost certainly a Spartan attempt to make him look bought. And at the end of that first year, the city held its public funeral for the war dead. They did this every year. The bones were laid out for 3 days in a tent so that people could bring offerings to their own. Then 10 cypress coffins, one for each tribe, and 1 empty bier carried for the missing. Then a procession out to the public cemetery, and any citizen or foreigner who wished could walk in it, and the women of the families came and mourned at the grave. And then a man chosen by the city gave the speech. In 430, it was Pericles. He begins by saying that he is not sure the custom is wise, since the reputation of many brave men should not depend on one man speaking well or badly. Then he does not talk about the dead at all, for most of it. He talks about the city. He says their constitution does not copy anyone else's, that it is called a democracy because power is in the hands of the many and not the few. He says that in private disputes everyone is equal before the law, and that in public life advancement goes by reputation for ability rather than by rotation of class, and that poverty is no barrier. A man who can do something useful for the city is not prevented by obscurity. He says they are free and tolerant in their private lives, and strict in public matters, obeying the laws and particularly the unwritten ones whose breach brings shame. He says they have provided more relief from work for the spirit than anyone else. Games and festivals through the year, and beautiful private homes, and the produce of the whole world arriving in their harbour, so that the goods of other countries are as familiar as their own. He says they leave their city open, and do not expel foreigners, and do not conceal what visitors might learn from, because they trust to their own courage rather than to preparation and secrecy. He says they love beauty without extravagance and knowledge without softness, that they use wealth as an opportunity rather than a boast, and that the real shame in poverty is not admitting it, but failing to escape it. He says that a man who takes no part in public affairs is not considered someone who minds his own business, but someone who has no business here at all. He says they think before they act and are not made timid by the thinking, because the truly brave man is the one who knows exactly what is pleasant and what is terrible and goes out to meet it anyway. And then he says, in short, our city is the school of Greece. And he says that the power of Athens is written on the sea and the land in monuments that will last, and that these men gave their bodies to the common good and took in exchange praise that does not grow old, and a grave that is not the earth they are buried in, but a memory in the minds of men, unwritten, carried without a tablet. And he turns to the parents and says the thing that everybody who has read it remembers, which is that, for the fortunate, death comes at the same moment as honor, and that they should be comforted by knowing that their sons' lives had a good ending rather than a long one. And to those still young enough, he says, plainly and without decoration, have other children. It is a magnificent speech, and I have given it to you at length on purpose, because of what comes next. Thucydides puts the plague immediately after it, not several chapters later. Immediately after, he finishes the funeral oration, notes that the winter ended and the second year of the war began, describes the Spartans invading again, and then writes that no sooner had they arrived than the sickness first began among the Athenians. That is not an accident of chronology. He could have arranged the material any way he liked. He put the greatest statement of what a city can be directly against the description of that city coming apart, with no comment in between, and left the two of them touching. It came in through the harbor, from Egypt by way of Africa and the eastern Mediterranean, in the summer of 430, into a city containing perhaps 3 times its normal population, packed into every available space, in the heat, in shelters, with the sanitation of a small town. Thucydides describes the symptoms in clinical order and tells you why he is doing it. He had it himself and recovered, and he saw others suffering, and he writes it down in detail so that if it ever comes again, it will be recognized. He describes heat in the head and redness and inflammation of the eyes, the throat and tongue bloody and the breath foul, sneezing and hoarseness, then a hard cough as it came down into the chest, then vomiting of every kind of bile that doctors have a name for, and terrible retching that brought up nothing. The skin was not especially hot to the touch, and not pale, but reddish and livid, breaking out in small blisters and open sores. Inside, the body burned so badly that patients could not bear even the lightest linen on them and wanted to be naked. And what they wanted most was to throw themselves into cold water, and some of the unattended ones did, into the public cisterns, driven by a thirst that drinking did not touch. Most died on the 7th or 8th or 9th day. Those who survived that often lost the extremities, fingers, toes, sometimes the eyes, and some lost their memory entirely when they got up, and did not know themselves or recognize their friends. Doctors were no help, and died in the greatest numbers because they went where the sick were. Prayers and oracles were no help either, and in the end people stopped consulting them. And then he describes the behavior, which is the part that stays with you. The worst of it, he says, was the despair. A man who felt it coming gave up immediately and did not resist. The birds and animals that fed on carrion either kept away from the bodies or died after touching them, and he notes that dogs, being domestic, made this very obvious. The temples filled with corpses because people had nowhere else to put the dying, and the sacred places were full of the dead. All the burial customs were overturned. People buried however they could, and some, having run out of everything after so many deaths in the family, resorted to shameless methods, coming across a pyre that other people had built, laying their own dead on it and setting it alight before the owners arrived, or, finding one already burning, throwing the body they were carrying onto the top of another man's and walking away. And beyond that, he says, the disaster was the beginning of a general lawlessness. Men who had been rich died suddenly, and men who had nothing inherited their property, and everybody could see that both fortune and life were arbitrary, and so people wanted quick enjoyment of what they had. Nobody was prepared to keep on with what had been thought honorable, because it was uncertain whether they would live to attain it. Whatever was pleasant, and whatever led to it, became honorable and useful. Fear of the gods and law of man restrained no one. The first, because everyone could see the pious dying exactly like everyone else, and the second, because nobody expected to live long enough to stand trial. It came back in 429, and again in 427 and 426, and Thucydides estimates that it killed something over a quarter of the fighting force, and modern estimates for the population of Attica as a whole run from a quarter to a third. In 1994, during work for the Athens metro, a mass grave was found at the edge of the Keroumakas cemetery. It was a shaft, and in it were somewhere around 150 bodies, laid in layers, with almost nothing in the way of grave goods, and the disorder increased as it went up, the lowest bodies more or less arranged, the upper ones simply put in. It was dated to around 430 by the pottery. That is Thucydides' description in physical form, not a corroboration of a detail, the behavior of a city running out of time to bury its dead properly, preserved in the stratigraphy. What the disease was, nobody knows. Typhus, typhoid, smallpox, measles, an epidemic form of typhoid, and viral hemorrhagic fevers have all been proposed with serious arguments. In 2006, a team extracted dental pulp from teeth in that grave and reported finding evidence pointing to typhoid fever, and the result was immediately and vigorously contested on methodological grounds and is not accepted as settled. Pericles lost both his legitimate sons. He was blamed for the war and for the strategy that had packed everybody into the city, was fined, and was removed from office. Then the Athenians, having nobody else, elected him again. He died of the plague in the autumn of 429, about 2.5 years into a war he had told them would take a long time. And Thucydides writes his obituary, and it is not a compliment to the democracy. He says that under Pericles, what was in name, a democracy, was in fact becoming rule by the first man, and that his successors, being more equal to one another and each grasping for the first place, ended by handing over even the conduct of affairs to the whims of the people. That is a man who had watched it happen, saying that the system worked while somebody was standing on top of it. 2 years later, that system did something extraordinary twice in 2 days. Mytilene, the main city on the island of Lesbos, revolted in 428. It was one of the very few members of the empire that still had its own fleet and had never been reduced to paying cash, which is precisely why it thought it could get away with it. It asked Sparta for help. The help was slow. Athens besieged the city and starved it, and when the Spartan commander inside armed the ordinary people of Mytilene to make a last attack, they immediately turned round and threatened to hand the city over unless they got a share of the food. So the government surrendered instead on terms and sent envoys to Athens. The assembly met, and in the anger of the moment, it voted to kill every adult male in Mytilene and to sell the women and children into slavery. Not the leaders of the revolt, the male population. A trireme was sent that afternoon with the decree. And then the city could not sleep. Thucydides says that the next day a feeling came over them, and they began to consider what a monstrous thing it was to destroy a whole city rather than the guilty. And the envoys from Mytilene and their Athenian supporters saw it and got the magistrates to put the question again, which was allowed because it was clear to the officials that most people wanted another chance to consider it. So they met again on the second day to vote on the same question. Cleon spoke first, in favor of carrying out the original decree. Thucydides introduces him as the most violent man in Athens, and at that time by far the most persuasive with the people. And I need to flag something here. Cleon is very probably the man who had Thucydides exiled 6 years later for failing to save Amphipolis. Every description we have of Cleon in this history comes from a man he ruined. Aristophanes hated him too and attacked him ferociously on stage. What we have of Cleon is entirely the account of 2 enemies, both brilliant, and there is no third witness. Cleon's speech is genuinely powerful and genuinely appalling. He tells them that a democracy is incapable of governing an empire. He says that their empire is a tyranny, held over unwilling subjects who plot against them, and that they are not liked, and that goodwill is not what keeps them there. He attacks them for being in love with clever speeches, for behaving like an audience at a performance rather than men deciding a policy, sitting there admiring the skill of the speakers and being carried away by novelty. He says that pity and pleasure in words and reasonableness are the three things most damaging to an empire, and he says, punish them as they deserve, and make an example that will teach the rest that revolt costs everything, because if you do not, you will be fighting your own allies instead of your enemies. Then a man called Diodotus answered him, and we know absolutely nothing about Diodotus. He appears once in this debate and vanishes from history. And the crucial thing about his speech is the ground he chooses to fight on. He does not argue for mercy. He explicitly refuses to. He says he is not going to talk about pity or about decency, and that this is not a trial, and they are not judges deciding what Mytilene deserves. They are a city deciding what is useful to itself. And then he argues, coldly, that mass execution is bad policy. He says that the death penalty does not deter, and gives a general argument about human nature that is remarkable for the 5th century. That poverty makes people bold out of necessity, and wealth makes them ambitious out of arrogance, and hope and desire are at work in every case, and no one has ever gone into a dangerous undertaking believing they would fail. Cities risk more than individuals, he says, because they are playing for higher stakes, and no severity of law has ever stopped it. Then the practical point. At present, he says, the common people in every allied city are on our side, and either take no part in revolts or, if they are forced into one, turn on the rebels as they just did in Mytilene, where it was the ordinary people who ended the siege by refusing to fight. If you kill the whole population, you tell every democratic faction in every allied city that they will be destroyed whether they support you or not, and you leave them nothing to gain by helping you. And every future revolt will fight to the last man, because surrender will be worthless. And he adds one more thing, which is the sentence that reveals what he actually thinks. It is far better to be wronged and put up with it than to be right and destroy people we should not destroy. They voted, and the vote was close. Thucydides says the show of hands was almost equal, and the second decree, reversing the first, passed. And now they had a problem, because the first trireme had a full day's start. The Mytilenean envoys, who were still in Athens, provisioned the second ship themselves, and promised the crew a large reward if they arrived in time. And the crew ate barley meal mixed with wine and olive oil at the oars, and rowed in shifts, sleeping in turns while the others pulled, and did not stop. And the first ship, Thucydides says, was in no hurry at all, because of the horrible thing it was carrying. The second one arrived just as the decree was being read out. Get in the second ship for a moment. You have been rowing for a day and a night, and most of another day. You are one of 170 men on benches in a hull about 120 feet long, and there is no room to stand upright, and no way to get away from the man in front of you. You eat where you sit. Somebody puts the barley and wine and oil in your hands, and you eat it with one hand while the other stays on the oar. And then you sleep for a while on the bench with the noise going on around you, and then you are shaken awake, and you pull again. Nobody is talking about what happens if you are late. Everybody has done the arithmetic, and everybody knows the other ship left yesterday, and everybody knows the arithmetic does not work unless nothing goes wrong. And you are rowing towards a city that you personally voted 2 days ago to destroy. Or you did not vote for it, and you were on the hill and you saw the hands go up, and you have been thinking about that for a day and a half with nothing to look at but the back of the man in front of you. They executed the ringleaders anyway, more than 1,000 of them, on Cleon's motion in a separate vote, and pulled down the city walls and took the fleet, and divided the land of the island into allotments for Athenian citizens. So it is not a story about mercy. It is a story about a city that talked itself into an atrocity in an afternoon, talked itself out of it overnight, and then did a smaller atrocity instead and thought of it as restraint. And 2 years after that, at a place called Pylos on the west coast of the Peloponnese, something happened that changed how the entire Greek world thought about Sparta. An Athenian force fortified a headland in Spartan territory. The Spartans reacted, and in the course of it, 420 Spartan soldiers ended up on a small island called Facturia across the harbour mouth, with the Athenian fleet in the water around them. Sparta immediately offered to negotiate. That in itself was extraordinary. Sparta had never asked for terms in living memory, and the offer was refused on Cleon's advice because the Athenians wanted more. Then the siege of the island dragged on and became embarrassing, and in the assembly Cleon attacked the generals for incompetence and said that if he were in charge, he would take the island within 20 days. And the assembly, which had had enough of him, called his bluff and gave him the command. And he did it in 20 days. 292 Spartans surrendered alive and were brought back to Athens as prisoners. You have to understand what that meant. The entire reputation of Sparta rested on the proposition that Spartans did not surrender. It was the thing every Greek believed about them, and it was the thing that made a Spartan army worth twice its numbers before it ever arrived. Thucydides says the whole Greek world was more astonished by this than by anything else in the war, because it had been assumed that Spartans would never give up their weapons under any circumstances, from hunger or from anything else. A Greek asked one of the prisoners afterwards, sneeringly, whether the men who had died were the fine ones, and the prisoner replied that an arrow would be worth a great deal if it could pick out the brave men, which Thucydides records as a very good answer, and which is the last word from Sparta on the subject. Athens kept the prisoners as hostages and announced that if a Spartan army ever entered Attica again, the hostages would be killed, and no Spartan army entered Attica for years. Cleon had been right, which is the most annoying possible outcome for everybody who has written about him since. The rest of that phase is quick. A Spartan general called Brasidas, who is the one Spartan in this war that Thucydides admires without reservation, and who was clever and fast and decent to the cities he took, went north and started detaching Athenian tribute cities one, by persuasion rather than siege. And he took Amphipolis, which was the most valuable Athenian possession in the region, because it controlled the timber the fleet was built from and a river crossing and the road east. The Athenian commander in the area arrived with 7 ships from Thasos, half a day too late. He saved the port downriver and lost the city. His name was Thucydides, son of Ulorus. He was tried and exiled, and he spent the next 20 years traveling and talking to people on both sides and writing, which is why we have any of this at all. 2 years later, outside Amphipolis, Cleon and Brasidas fought a battle, and both of them were killed in it. The 2 men who had most wanted the war to continue, one on each side, died on the same afternoon. Peace was signed within months. The peace lasted 6 years on paper and almost none in practice. Neither side gave back what it had promised. Several of Sparta's allies refused to sign it at all. There was a strange interval in which both powers were technically at peace and were funding, arming, and encouraging people who were fighting each other. And in 418, an Athenian-backed coalition was beaten by Sparta in a large land battle at Mantinea, which quietly restored the Spartan reputation that Pylos had damaged. And in the summer of 416, Athens sent 38 ships and about 3,000 men to a small island called Melos. Melos is in the southern Aegean, a volcanic island with a good harbor, perhaps a few thousand people. It had been settled from Sparta centuries earlier, and it was proud of that. It was not in the Athenian Empire. It had never been in the Athenian Empire. It was not fighting Athens, and it was not helping Sparta in any way that anyone could point to. It was neutral, and it had stayed neutral through 15 years of war. Athens had come once before, 6 years earlier, and demanded tribute and been refused, and had gone away again. This time they came to stay. And what happened before the fighting started is the passage in Thucydides that people still argue about in international relations seminars, and it is set out as a dialogue, the only extended one in the entire book, with the two sides answering each other in short exchanges. I have to repeat the caution here, because it matters more in this chapter than anywhere else. This is a reconstruction. Thucydides was in exile and was not present. He tells us in his introduction that he wrote what he judged was required in the circumstances. So the Melian dialogue is a serious historian's considered account of what the argument must have amounted to, not a transcript. Take it, then, as the most honest thing an Athenian ever wrote about what Athens had become, which may be closer to the truth than a transcript would have been. The Athenians asked for a meeting, and the Melian government did not let them address the assembly of the people. They brought them in front of the magistrates and the leading citizens instead, in a room. And the Athenians, in effect, said, "We notice what you are doing. You are keeping us away from the crowd, so that ordinary people do not hear a continuous persuasive speech from us all at once and get carried away. Fine. Then let us do this differently. Do not make a set speech either. Interrupt us whenever you think we have said something wrong, and answer point by point." And the Melians agreed and observed dryly that the reasonableness of quietly instructing each other sits rather oddly beside the war that is going to follow if the instruction does not work, and that they can see perfectly well that this meeting has two possible outcomes, slavery or destruction. Then the Athenians said the thing. They said, "We are not going to make a long and unconvincing speech about how we deserve to rule because we defeated the Persians, or claim that we are attacking you because you have wronged us, because you have not. And we ask you not to imagine you will persuade us by saying that you are a colony of Sparta and have never joined the war against us, or that you have done us no injury. We should both," they said, "aim at what is actually achievable, given what we both really think, because you know as well as we do that questions of justice arise only between equals in power, and that in the real world the strong do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept." The Melians answered that in that case they would appeal to expediency instead, since justice was off the table, and they made an argument that is genuinely good, that it is in Athens' own interest to allow the principle that people in danger should be treated reasonably, because Athens will one day be in danger herself, and will want that principle to exist when she is. The Athenians said they were not worried about that. If our empire ends, they said, we will take our chances then. And then the conversation goes round and round, and each time the Melians reach for something to stand on, the Athenians take it away. The Melians say, "How can it be to your advantage to enslave us when it cannot be to ours to serve?" The Athenians say, "Because you would gain by submitting before you have suffered anything, and we would gain by not destroying you." The Melians say, "Would you not accept our neutrality, friends instead of enemies, allies of neither side?" And the Athenians say no, and the reason is the most revealing thing in the dialogue. They say, "Your hostility does not hurt us as much as your friendship would, because to our subjects, your friendship would look like weakness in us, and your hatred looks like proof of our power. It is not the mainland states that concern us. It is the islanders, the people we already rule, and people like you who are still free, because they are the ones who might do something reckless." In other words, We cannot let you be neutral, precisely because you are small and harmless and have done nothing. If a small, harmless island can stay out, everybody will want to stay out. The Melians say that would be a poor sort of morality on their part, to give up their freedom without even trying. The Athenians say, this is not a contest of honor between equals where losing would be a disgrace. This is about survival, and about not resisting people who are far stronger than you. The Melians say, but the fortune of war is more impartial than the difference in numbers suggests. If we give in now, we lose hope immediately. If we act, there is still hope of standing upright. And the Athenians answer that with the coldest thing in it. They say, hope is a comfort in danger, and for people who have plenty in reserve, hope may damage them but does not destroy them. But for people who stake everything on a single throw, and hope by its nature is extravagant, its real character is only discovered at the moment when they have lost everything, and by then there is nothing left to protect themselves with. Do not, they say, be like the common run of people who could still be saved by human means, and who, when visible hopes have failed them in their distress, turn to invisible ones, to prophecy and oracles, and all the other things that ruin men by giving them hope. The Melians say, we trust that the gods will give us fortune equal to yours, because we are righteous men standing against unrighteous ones, and we trust that Sparta will help us, if only out of shame, since we are their kin. And the Athenians say, about the gods, we believe of the gods, and we know of men, that by a necessity of their nature they rule wherever they can. We did not make this law, and we are not the first to act on it. We found it in existence, and we shall leave it to exist forever among those who come after us. We simply happen to be using it, and we are quite sure that you would do exactly the same in our position. And about Sparta, they say, the Spartans are the most conspicuous people we know for identifying what they find agreeable with what is honorable, and what suits their interest with what is just. They will not come. The Melians asked for a moment to consult among themselves. Then they came back and gave their answer. They said, our decision, Athenians, is the same as it was at first. We are not going to give up in a moment the freedom of a city that has existed for 700 years. We will trust to the fortune that the gods have preserved it with until now, and to the help of men and of the Spartans, and we will try to save ourselves. And we invite you to allow us to be friends to you and enemies to neither side, and to leave our territory after making a treaty that seems suitable to us both. And the Athenians, leaving the conference, said, well, judging by this decision, you seem to us to be the only people who consider the future more certain than what is in front of your eyes, and who look at what you cannot see as though it were already happening because you would like it to be. You have staked everything on Sparta, and on luck, and on hope, and everything is what you will lose. Sit in that room for a moment. Be one of the magistrates. There are perhaps 20 of you. You know all of these men. You have known some of them your whole life. The Athenians are standing at the other end of the room, and they have been entirely polite throughout, and they have not raised their voices once. And here is the thing that makes it unbearable. You understand the argument perfectly, every word of it. You are not being confused or tricked. You follow the logic, and you can see that it holds, and you can see that they know that you can see it. And you have nothing to put against it, except the things you were raised on, that there are gods, and they mind about this sort of thing, that your relatives across the water will come, because they are your relatives. That 700 years of a place existing must count for something. You look at the men around the room, and you already know how the vote goes, because you know these people, and because every single one of them is thinking the same thing, which is that they are not going to be the ones who hand it over. There is a window. Outside it, the same harbor that was there yesterday. The siege took the rest of the summer and into the winter. Sparta did not come. There was some treachery inside the city at the end, and hunger, and the Melians surrendered unconditionally. Thucydides reports what followed in a single sentence, with no comment, in the flattest language he uses anywhere. The Athenians killed all the adult men whom they took, and sold the women and children as slaves. And afterwards they sent out 500 settlers and colonized the place themselves. That is the end of the book's 5th section. And the very next thing he writes, the first sentence of the next section, the following winter, is that the Athenians decided to sail against Sicily with a greater force, and to subdue it if they could. He does not connect them. He puts them next to each other and moves on. It is the single most effective piece of editing in ancient literature. Here is the first thing to know about the Sicilian expedition. They did not know what Sicily was. Thucydides says it plainly, and it is astonishing. Most of them, he says, were ignorant of the size of the island and of the number of its inhabitants, both Greek and non-Greek, and did not realize that they were taking on a war not much smaller than the one against the Spartans. Sicily is not a small island. It is the largest in the Mediterranean. It was thickly settled with large Greek cities that had been there for 300 years, and Syracuse alone was comparable to Athens in size and wealth, with a similar constitution and a similar fleet. The Athenians were proposing to cross 800 miles of sea in the middle of an unfinished war and conquer a place they had not surveyed. The pretext was an appeal from Sugesta, a small city in the west, which was in a border dispute and asked for help and promised to pay for the campaign. The Athenians sent envoys to check whether Sugesta actually had the money. The Sugestans took the envoys around the temples and showed them silver and gold plate, and had borrowed most of it from neighboring towns, and moved the same dishes from house to house as the envoys were entertained, so that every host appeared to own a fortune. The envoys came home and reported that the money was there. The debate happened in the spring of 415, and the most extraordinary thing in it is the way the opposition case destroyed itself. Nicias, an experienced, cautious, wealthy, superstitious, rather decent man in his 50s, who had negotiated the peace treaty that carried his name, argued against the whole idea. He said they were leaving many enemies behind them and going to fetch new ones. He said even if they won, they could not hold a place that far away. He pointed out that the peace was fragile and that Sparta was waiting for exactly this. He lost, so he tried a second approach, and it is one of the great miscalculations in political history. He came back and said, "Very well, but understand what this needs. Not the 60 ships you are imagining. If we do this, we need it done properly. A huge fleet, heavy infantry, archers, slingers, cavalry, transports and grain, because we will be operating in hostile country with no reliable base." He inflated the requirement, deliberately, to a level he thought would frighten them into dropping it. And the assembly listened to the list, and got more enthusiastic, and voted him everything he asked for and rather more, and appointed him one of the 3 commanders. Thucydides says the effect of his speech was the exact opposite of what he intended. They thought that now it would be a safe expedition, and there came upon all of them like a passion for the voyage. The older men thought they would either conquer, or at least come to no harm with such a force. The young wanted to see a distant country, and the ordinary mass of soldiers expected to earn money now, and to add territory that would provide inexhaustible pay in the future. And one man was very much in favor, and he is the reason for most of what follows. Alcibiades was about 35. He was Pericles' ward. His mother's family and Pericles were connected, and after his father died at a battle, he had been brought up in Pericles' household. He was rich, spectacularly handsome by every account, a friend and probably a former student of Socrates, and he had a stammer or a lisp that people found charming rather than ridiculous. He was also the most conspicuous person in Athens, and he worked at it. He entered 7 chariots in one Olympic Games, which no private individual had ever done, and took first, second, and fourth. He had a golden shield made with a private emblem, instead of a civic one. He walked around trailing a long purple cloak. There is a story that he cut the tail off an unusually beautiful dog he had paid an enormous sum for, and told his friends that he had done it so the Athenians would talk about that rather than about anything worse. His argument for Sicily was, according to Thucydides, partly strategic and mostly personal. He wanted the command, he wanted the glory, and he wanted the money because his private expenses were beyond what he could actually afford. And he told the assembly that his extravagance was a public asset, since his chariot victories made Athens look rich and strong to the whole Greek world. The fleet gathered through the spring, and in the last days before it sailed, somebody went round Athens at night and mutilated the Herms. The Herms were stone pillars with a carved head and an erect phallus, standing outside doorways and at street corners and crossroads all over the city, protective objects, ordinary, everywhere. In one night, most of them in the city had their faces broken off. It is impossible to overstate how frightening this was. It was coordinated, it was citywide, it was done by people who knew the city, and it was sacrilege on an enormous scale immediately before the largest expedition Athens had ever launched. The city concluded, reasonably, that it was a signal that a conspiracy was preparing to overthrow the democracy. Investigations were opened, informers were rewarded, and the inquiry immediately widened to another accusation, that the mysteries, the secret initiation rites at Ulysses, the most sacred thing the Athenians had been performed as entertainment in private houses, in mockery, at drinking parties, and Alcibiades was named in that. He demanded to be tried immediately before sailing. He said he would rather be executed than sail under an accusation. His enemies, who could see that the army and the fleet were full of men who liked him and that a trial now would probably acquit him, argued that he should sail at once and be tried when he came back. So the fleet went out in June, and Thucydides describes the morning, the whole city coming down to Piraeus, citizens and foreigners together to see it off, the crews at their benches, a trumpet calling for silence, the prayers said not ship by ship, but by all of them together, led by a herald, with wine mixed in bowls, and the officers pouring libations from gold and silver cups. And then the paean sung, and the ships going out of the harbour in line, and then racing each other as far as Aegina. It was, he says, the most costly and the finest-looking force that had ever gone out from a single Greek city up to that time. And a few months later, in Sicily, an official ship arrived with orders recalling Alcibiades to stand trial. He was allowed to sail home in his own ship, under escort. At the first stop on the Italian coast, he and his companions got off and disappeared. He was condemned to death in his absence, and he went to Sparta. And in Sparta, he told them 2 things. He told them to send a Spartan general to Sicily to take command of the defense, and they sent a man called Gylippus, who arrived at exactly the moment it mattered. And he told them to stop invading Attica for a few weeks every summer and instead, permanently, fortify a place called Disulia, 14 miles from Athens, and hold it all year round. Both pieces of advice were taken. Both were decisive. Now the campaign, and the whole of it is a story about a wall. The Athenians landed and did not attack immediately. They spent time on diplomacy that produced very little, wintered, and then, in the second summer, began the correct siege operation, which was to build a wall right across the landward side of Sicily, from the sea on one side to the sea on the other. If the wall closes, the city is cut off, and eventually the city starves, and the siege is won. They started from a fort in the middle, and worked outwards in both directions. And the Serucaeosans built counter walls. They ran their own walls out at right angles to intersect the Athenian line before it could close. The Athenians attacked the counter walls and destroyed the first one, and then a second, and each time it cost them days and men. And the whole war in Sicily comes down to that, a race between two construction projects in the summer heat, watched by both sides. Then Gylippus arrived from Sparta with a small force, and got into the city, and took charge, and built a third counterwall past the end of the Athenian line, and the Athenian wall never closed. That is the moment the expedition fails. Not a battle, a wall that does not reach the sea. And after that the besiegers become the besieged. The Athenian camp was in a marshy area by the harbour, and it was autumn, and then it was summer again, and the army began to sicken. The fleet, drawn up on a beach in enemy country with no dockyard, could not be properly maintained, and the hulls became waterlogged and slow while the Syracusan ships stayed dry and fast. Nicias, who was ill, he had a kidney disease, and Thucydides mentions it more than once, wrote to Athens. The letter is quoted, and it is remarkable for its honesty. He tells them that the besiegers have become the besieged, that his ships are rotten and his crews are deserting, and the slaves in his rowing benches are running away, that he cannot enforce discipline over an army in this condition, and that they must either recall the whole force or send a second one just as large. And he asks to be relieved of the command on grounds of health. Athens refused to recall him and sent the second force. 73 more ships and about 5,000 more heavy infantry arrived in the summer of 413, under Demosthenes, who was an aggressive and capable general, and who took one look at the situation and understood it immediately. They had to break through now, at once, or leave. He attempted a night attack on the high ground above the city. Night attacks were almost unheard of, and Thucydides notes the difficulty. In the dark, in unfamiliar country, with men from many different cities, nobody could tell what was happening, and the watchword kept being shouted so often that the enemy learned it and used it, and men killed men on their own side. And the Dorian troops on both sides sang the same battle hymn, so that Athenian allies hearing a paean out of the darkness could not tell whether it was friends or enemies singing it. It failed, and Demosthenes said, "We leave immediately, while we still can, by sea tonight." Nicias refused, partly because he was afraid of what the assembly at home would do to a general who came back having achieved nothing, and he said so out loud that the Athenians would condemn them, and that many of the soldiers who were now shouting that they were in a terrible position would be shouting the opposite at home, and that he would rather die at the hands of the enemy than by the judgment of the Athenians, partly because he had intelligence that Serucaeos was running out of money, and there was a party inside willing to betray the city. They stayed. Weeks passed. The Serucaeosans were reinforced, and finally, with the situation obviously hopeless, everything was prepared for the fleet to leave. And on the night they were to sail, on the 27th of August, 413, there was an eclipse of the moon. The army was disturbed. The seers were consulted. Nicias, who Thucydides says was rather too much given to divination and things of that kind, refused to allow any discussion of moving until they had waited 3 times 9 days. 27 days. In 27 days, the Serucaeosans blocked the harbour mouth with a line of ships chained and moored across it. What follows is the last sea battle, fought inside a closed harbour, and it is one of the most remarkable pieces of writing in Greek. About 200 ships in a space with no room to manoeuvre, so that the fighting became boarding actions and hand-to-hand combat on decks, with grappling irons and archers, and ships crashing into each other by accident. And on the shore, both armies were watching. Thucydides describes the Athenians on the beach and it is the passage I would keep if I could only keep one. The struggle on the ships being so evenly matched, he says, the land army suffered an agony of mind because the outcome was so close, and because from the shore they could see everything and could see it differently depending on where they stood. Those looking at a part where their own side was winning would take heart and call on the gods not to deprive them of safety. Those looking at a part where their side was losing cried out in despair, and others, watching a part that was undecided, swayed their bodies backwards and forwards in the greatest torment, because at every moment they were almost, and never quite, saved. And there was every kind of sound coming from one army, lamentation, cheering, "We are winning, we are losing," all at once, from men standing a few feet apart. You are on the deck of one of those ships, and you cannot see anything except what is directly in front of you. There is a hull grinding against yours and men on it. There is shouting from every direction, and it means nothing because it is coming from 180 ships. And behind all of it, from the shore, there is the noise of your own army, thousands of men, and it rises and falls, and you cannot tell what it means. There is no way to know if you are winning. Not from here. You can hear that something is happening somewhere, and you cannot tell whether the sound is triumph or grief, and every so often it changes, and you cannot tell which way it changed. They lost, and they had enough ships left to try again, and the crews refused to board. So they burned what they could not take and went inland on foot, about 40,000 people, soldiers and camp followers, moving away from the coast into hostile country in high summer. They left the wounded and the sick behind in the camp. Thucydides makes you hear that. The men who were being left clinging to their friends and following as far as they could and calling after them and falling behind, and the crying and the reproaches, so that the whole army was in tears and could hardly move. They marched for 8 days. They were harassed the entire way by cavalry and javelin men, and could not respond. Demosthenes' division, which was at the back, was cut off and surrounded and surrendered, 6,000 men, on terms that no one would be executed or imprisoned or die of want. And Nicias' division kept going, and on the 6th day reached a river called the Asinaris. They had had no water for some time, and they went down the bank into the river in a mass, and the discipline collapsed entirely, and everyone wanted to get across first, and the enemy above them on the bank made it very difficult. The Athenians went into the riverbed and fell over each other and were trampled, and some were killed by their own spears and equipment, and the enemy came down the far bank and shot into them. And the Athenians in the water went on drinking. Thucydides says the water was immediately fouled and was muddy and full of blood, and that they drank it anyway, and most of them were still fighting for it. Nicias surrendered to Gylippus personally and asked him to stop the killing. The prisoners, Thucydides says 7,000 were taken into public custody, and that far more were taken privately and hidden away by individual soldiers as personal property, were put in the stone quarries outside Serukaios. The quarries are still there. They are deep, sheer-sided pits cut into the rock where the building stone for the city had come from, open to the sky, with no shelter. They were kept in them for 10 weeks. Thucydides, crowded together in a narrow pit, with no roof over them, suffering first from the sun and the suffocating heat, and then the nights coming on autumnal and cold. The change to such extremes brought on disease. They did everything in the same place because there was no room. The dead were heaped on one another and left where they died, because men were dying of their wounds and from the change of temperature, and from what they were being given, which was a small measure of water and a small measure of grain a day. Every misery, he says, that could come upon men in such a place came upon them. After 10 weeks, the allies were sold. The Athenians and the Sicilian Greeks who had fought with them were kept longer. Nicias and Demosthenes were both executed, against Gylippus' wishes, who had wanted to take them home to Sparta alive. Plutarch preserves a story about the survivors that may or may not be true, and that I have never been able to shake. He says that some of the prisoners were saved by Euripides, that the Sicilians were passionately fond of his poetry, and that men who could recite pieces of it were given food and water or set free, and that some who got home afterwards went to find Euripides and thanked him. Thucydides' summary of the whole thing is 4 sentences, and it does not editorialize, and it does not need to. This was the greatest action of the war, he says, and in his judgment, the greatest of all Greek actions we know of, the most brilliant for the winners and the most disastrous for the losers. They were beaten completely at every point and suffered severely in every way, and it was total destruction. The fleet, the army, everything was destroyed, and out of many, few returned home. Stand in the quarry at night. It is October now. The stone walls go up 60 or 70 feet on every side, and the top edge is a line against the stars. In the daytime the rock holds the heat, and there is no shade anywhere at any hour. And now, at night, the same rock has gone cold, and the men against the walls are the coldest. There is not enough room to lie down properly. You have worked out a way to sit that you can hold for a few hours. Someone up on the rim tips down the water at a certain hour, and the grain, and there is a movement in the pit each time that is not a fight exactly, but that you have learned to be careful of. And in 6 weeks you have stopped noticing the smell, which is the thing you would have said, in June, that a human being could never stop noticing. Above the rim you can see the sky, and it is completely clear, and it is the same sky that is over Athens, and there is nobody up there looking down. When the news reached Athens, nobody believed it. Plutarch tells a story about how it arrived. A stranger got off a ship at Piraeus, went into a barber's shop, and began talking about the disaster as though everybody already knew. The barber ran into the city and told the magistrates, and the man was put on the wheel and tortured as a rumor-monger because no official report had come. He was still being questioned when the messengers arrived. Thucydides says that when they did accept it, they turned on the speakers who had been enthusiastic for the expedition, as though they had not voted for it themselves. Now, everything you know about how stories work, says Athens, falls here. The fleet is gone. The army is gone. 200 ships and something like 50,000 men, counting the crews and the allies, are dead or in a quarry. There is a permanent Spartan, fought 14 miles from the city. The treasury is nearly empty. Athens held out for 9 more years. That is the genuinely astonishing part of this story, and it is almost always skipped, because it is a long, grinding, complicated stretch with no single dramatic shape to it. But it is where the character of the place actually shows. They melted down what they could. They broke into the reserve fund of 1,000 talents that Pericles had set aside at the start of the war and forbidden anyone to touch, except in the event of an enemy fleet attacking the city itself, which had been sitting untouched for 18 years. They stripped gold from the temples. They cut and built new ships. They appointed a board of 10 older men to review business before it went to the assembly, which is the first admission in a century that pure democracy might need a break. And the empire started to come apart, because everyone could see the arithmetic. Chios revolted, then Miletus, then Rhodes, then most of the Ionian coast. Persia, which had been out of the picture for 50 years, came back in, not with armies but with money, funding a Spartan fleet, because a Persian satrap could see that the cheapest possible outcome was 2 Greek powers exhausting each other. Meanwhile, Disulia did exactly what Alcibiades had promised it would. A permanent fortified garrison inside Attica, occupied all year, meant that the Athenians could not work their land at all, ever, rather than losing a few weeks of it each summer. It meant the overland grain route was cut, and everything had to come by sea round the coast at greater cost. And Thucydides records that more than 20,000 slaves deserted, a great many of them skilled workers. A large proportion of those were from the silver mines at Laurion. The mines effectively stopped. The money that had built the fleet in 483 stopped coming out of the ground in the decade when they needed it most. And then, in 411, the democracy was overthrown by Athenians. It was done carefully, and it was done through the constitution, which is what makes it interesting. A group of oligarchic clubs, private associations of wealthy men that had existed for years, worked with officers in the fleet at Samos and with returning politicians to promote a proposal that Persia would fund Athens instead of Sparta if only Athens would abandon the democracy, and that in any case the state could no longer afford pay for public office. They created an atmosphere first. Prominent democratic speakers were assassinated quietly, and no one was ever caught. And Thucydides says that after a few of these, no one dared say anything in opposition, because nobody knew who was in the conspiracy and nobody could trust anybody. Men found themselves suspicious of people they had known for years. The assembly and the council still met, and nothing was said in them that had not been approved beforehand, and every speaker knew he might be talking to a member. And then, at a specially convened assembly held outside the city walls, at a place where the crowd would be smaller and the country people less likely to come, they proposed the abolition of the existing constitution and its replacement by a body of 5,000, who were never actually enrolled, with power in the hands of a council of 400. It passed. Thucydides notes, with the driest possible touch, that it was not easy about 100 years after the tyrants were expelled to deprive the Athenian people of their liberty, a people who had not merely refused to be subject to anyone else, but had been accustomed for more than half that time to rule over others. The 400 lasted 4 months, and what broke them was the fleet. The Athenian navy was at Samos. It was crewed overwhelmingly by the poorest citizens, because that is who rowed, and rowers were the constituency the democracy served most directly. When word reached them of what had happened at home, the fleet held its own assembly, deposed its own suspect officers, elected new generals, swore to maintain the democracy, and declared that it was not in revolt from Athens. Athens had revolted from it. They took the position, and Thucydides reports the argument with some relish, that they were the more genuine city, since they possessed the ships and the money and the men, and that the people at home merely possessed the buildings. They also, having no leader they trusted, sent for Alcibiades, who by this point had left Sparta as well, after being accused of sleeping with the wife of a Spartan king and had been advising a Persian satrap. He came, and he did one genuinely useful thing immediately. The fleet wanted to sail straight home and attack the 400, and he stopped them, and Thucydides thinks this saved the city, because that would have handed Ionia to the enemy in an afternoon. The oligarchy collapsed on its own, in stages, in factional splits, and gave way to a broader constitution of the 5,000 which Thucydides, who was no democrat, says was the best government the Athenians had in his lifetime, a moderate blend. Within a year, the full democracy was back. And then Alcibiades won a series of victories. The best of them was at Cyzicus in 410, where he trapped a Spartan fleet with a feint in bad weather and destroyed it completely, and a captured Spartan dispatch was intercepted afterwards that has become famous for its brevity. It read in its entirety, "Ships lost, commander dead, men starving, do not know what to do." Sparta sued for peace. Athens, on the advice of a popular leader, refused. Alcibiades came home in 407 for the first time in 8 years, and it was a triumph. The condemnation was annulled. The curses that had been publicly pronounced against him were revoked. His property was restored. and he was elected commander with full powers. He lasted a year. He was away from the fleet, and his deputy, against orders, took on a battle and lost some ships. It was a small defeat, but it was Alcibiades, and the Athenians had never entirely stopped being frightened of him, and he was not re-elected. He went to a private fortress in Thrace and stayed there. Which brings us to 406, and to the single worst thing the assembly ever did to itself. There was a battle at the Arginusi Islands, and it was a real victory, the biggest naval win of the whole war. 70 Spartan ships lost against 25 Athenian. But a storm blew up afterwards, and the crews of the 25 wrecked Athenian ships were left in the water, and the men detailed to pick up the survivors and recover the dead did not do it. Whether the storm made it genuinely impossible was disputed at the time and cannot be resolved now. Athens put its own victorious generals on trial. 8 were involved. 2 did not come home, correctly assessing the situation. The 6 who did were tried for failing to rescue the shipwrecked. And the assembly, in a fury, inflamed by relatives appearing in mourning clothes at the festival that fell in between, voted to try all 6 together in a single vote rather than individually. That was flatly illegal. Athenian law required separate trials. There was a decree on the books saying so. The presiding committee that day was the 50 men of one tribe, and the chairman was drawn by lot. Most of the committee initially refused to put an illegal motion to the vote, and then were threatened with being included in the charge themselves, and gave way. One man refused. Socrates, son of Sophroniscus, of the deme Ulapusi, a stonemason's son in his 60s, who happened to be serving his year on the council and happened to be on duty that day, refused to put the motion. He said he would not act against the law. He was the only one. They took the vote anyway over him. The 6 generals were condemned and executed. One of them was Pericles' son by Aspasia, the boy the assembly had made a citizen by special exemption 35 years earlier. Xenophon says that not long afterwards the Athenians regretted it and voted that complaints be brought against the men who had deceived the people, and that those men were held for trial and escaped. They had executed 6 of their best commanders in the 4th to last year of a war they were losing. The end came the next autumn, and it came from carelessness. The Athenian fleet, 180 ships, everything left, was beached at a place called Aegospotumi on the Hellespont, on the European side, opposite the Spartan fleet under Lysander. It was a bad position. There was no town, and no harbor, and no market, so the crews had to scatter inland every day to buy food. For 4 days they rowed out and offered battle, and Lysander refused, and each afternoon they came back and beached, and the men dispersed. And Alcibiades, who was living in his fortress a few miles away, rowed down to the beach and told the generals that they were in an indefensible spot and should move to a proper harbor up the coast where there was a town and supplies. They told him to go away. One of them said that he was not the commander, they were. On the 5th day, Lysander watched the Athenian crews disperse as usual, and then came across the strait at speed and took almost the entire Athenian navy on the beach, empty. 9 ships got away. Something like 3,000 or 4,000 Athenian prisoners were executed. The war was effectively over that afternoon, and the last act took a winter. Xenophon describes the night the news arrived at Piraeus. The sound of it, he says, ran up from the port along the long walls into the city, one man passing it to another, and nobody slept, not only for the men who had died, but far more for themselves, because they expected now to suffer exactly what they had done to others. To the Melians, to the people of Histiaea and Seone and Torone and Ugina. Lysander did not need to fight. He simply took the fleet to Piraeus, closed the harbor, and sent every Athenian he captured anywhere in the Aegean back to Athens, deliberately, to increase the number of mouths inside the walls. The siege lasted through the winter. People starved, and there was a debate about terms, and one negotiator was imprisoned for suggesting that the walls might have to come down, and eventually he was sent to Sparta himself and came back with the terms, having waited, by his own account, until hunger had done the arguing for him. Corinth and Thebes wanted Athens destroyed and the population sold, the standard treatment, and precisely what Athens had done at Melos. Sparta refused, and the stated reason was that they would not enslave a Greek city that had done so much good for Greece at the time of the greatest danger. That is Xenophon's account, and it is possible Sparta simply did not want Corinth and Thebes becoming dominant with Athens gone. Both things can be true. The terms: pull down the long walls and the walls of Piraeus, surrender all but 12 ships, give up all overseas possessions, take back the exiles, and follow Sparta in war and peace. And in the spring of 404 they took the walls down, with the flute girls playing, and the men doing the demolition, believing, or saying, that this was the first day of freedom for Greece. What followed was 8 months that Athens spent the next century trying not to talk about. A commission of 30 men was appointed to revise the constitution, backed by a Spartan garrison on the Acropolis. They are known as the 30 Tyrants. Their leading figure was Critias, who was an aristocrat, a poet, a former associate of Socrates, and an extremist. They began by prosecuting informers and generally unpopular men, and this was popular. Then they moved on to anyone likely to oppose them. Then they moved on to the rich, because they needed money for the garrison, and each of the 30 was told to arrest a resident foreigner and take his property. One of them, Thuramunes, objected that this was going too far and was condemned by his own colleagues and executed. He drank the hemlock and, according to Xenophon, flicked the last drops out of the cup the way you did at a drinking party, and named Critias. In 8 months, they killed about 1,500 people. That is a larger number than Athens lost in most of the battles in this account, and it was done by Athenians to Athenians in peacetime in a city of perhaps 30,000 adult male citizens. 5,000 or more fled, and the Democrats regrouped at a fort called Phyle up in the hills on the border, in the winter, in the snow, under a man called Thrasybulus, starting with about 70 men. The number grew. They came down and seized Piraeus. There was a battle in the streets of the port, and Critias was killed in it. And then Sparta, specifically the Spartan king Pausanias, over Lysander's objections, brokered a settlement rather than crushing the Democrats, and the democracy was restored in 403. And the Athenians did something that I think is the most impressive thing in this entire 2 hours. They passed an amnesty. Not a vague gesture, a formal, sworn, enforced agreement that no one would be prosecuted for anything done during the civil conflict, with the exception of the 30 themselves and a few named officials, and even they could stand trial if they submitted to an audit. Everyone else, the informers, the men who had gone along with it, the people who had denounced neighbors, the ones who had taken the confiscated property, was covered. The Greek phrase for it means, roughly, not to remember the bad things. There is a surviving court speech in which a man complains that his opponent is trying to bring up things from that period, and the argument he makes is simply that this is not allowed, and it is treated as decisive. It held. There were cases where it was tested, and it held. A city that had just been through a terror, whose people knew precisely who had denounced whose brother, agreed to stop, and mostly did. That is the last, unambiguously admirable thing the Athenian democracy does in this story. 4 years later, they killed Socrates. He was about 70. He was a stonemason's son, and had probably worked as one. He was poor, and by the accounts of his friends this was a choice. He refused payment for teaching. Unlike the professional teachers of rhetoric he is often confused with, and his poverty was part of the argument he was making. He was ugly in a way that everyone thought worth mentioning. Snub-nosed, bulging eyes, a face compared to a satyr's. He went barefoot. He had a wife called Xanthippe and 3 sons, one still small. He had also served as a heavy infantryman in at least 3 campaigns, and at Delium, in a general rout, he was noticed for walking away from the field calmly and looking around him, which Plato says made the pursuing cavalry leave him alone, because a man who looked like that was clearly going to be trouble. What he did was ask questions in the marketplace. The method was consistent. He would find someone who was confident that they knew what something was, courage, or piety, or justice, and ask them to say what it was, and then take the definition apart by asking further questions until the person admitted they could not say. He claimed throughout that he knew nothing himself, and that the only sense in which he was wise was that he was aware of it. He also, and this is not incidental, did this to important people in public, in front of their followers, and he was extremely good at it, and the young men of the best families found it hilarious and started imitating it. In 399, he was charged with impiety, not recognizing the gods the city recognizes, introducing new divinities, and corrupting the young. To understand the trial, you have to understand the weather it happened in, and Plato's version, which is the one everyone reads, does not stress it, because Plato is making a different argument. Socrates' closest associates included Alcibiades, who had defected to Sparta, advised them on how to beat Athens, and then defected to Persia, and Critias, the leader of the 30, who had killed 1,500 Athenians 4 years earlier. Critias had been a member of the circle for years. You could not prosecute a man in 399 for having taught Critias. The amnesty forbade it explicitly. Nobody could raise the 30 in court. So they raised the gods. Whether the prosecutors were sincere is unknowable. What is not in doubt is that a jury of 501 Athenians, 4 years after a terror led by a man who had spent his youth listening to Socrates, was asked whether Socrates corrupted young men, and that everybody in that room knew which young men were meant, and that nobody was allowed to say it out loud. The trial took 1 day. There were no professional judges and no lawyers. Each side spoke, timed by a water clock, and then the jury voted immediately, without deliberation, by dropping bronze tokens into an urn. Plato's account of the defense, the apology, has Socrates refused to do any of the things a defendant was expected to do. He does not weep. He does not bring his children in to appeal for sympathy, and he says explicitly that he will not, and that he has 3 sons and is not going to parade them, because it would be undignified for him and for the city and for the jury. He says that he has spent his life doing this because of an oracle at Delphi that said no one was wiser than he was, which he did not believe, and which he spent years trying to disprove by finding a wiser man, and failed, and concluded that his only advantage was knowing that he did not know. He says the god has attached him to the city, the way a gadfly is attached to a large and well-bred horse that has grown sluggish, and that the horse would very much like to swat him, and that they will not easily find another. He says he would rather die having spoken as he has than live having said what they wanted. He was convicted, on Plato's figures, by about 30 votes out of 501, meaning a shift of 30 people would have acquitted him. Then came the second stage. Athenian procedure had no fixed sentences for many offenses. The prosecution proposed a penalty, the defendant proposed an alternative, and the jury chose between the two. There was no third option. In practice, defendants proposed something serious enough to be plausible, and exile was routinely available, and everybody expected it here, Xenophon says explicitly that he could have had exile and that a great many people would have been relieved. The prosecution proposed death, and Socrates proposed that, since a benefactor of the city who was poor and needed leisure to keep exhorting people deserved a public reward, the appropriate penalty was free meals at public expense in the town hall for the rest of his life, the honor given to Olympic victors. He was talked down by his friends, who were frantic, to a fine, which they offered to guarantee. The jury voted for death, and more of them voted for death than had voted to convict. Sit in that room. You are one of 501. You have a bronze token in your hand. You are probably over 30, and you are getting 3 obols for the day. You have been here since morning, and it is now late afternoon. You know this man by sight. Everyone does. He has been in the marketplace your entire adult life, barefoot, stopping people. He may have stopped you once. He is old now. You have already voted once today, and it was close. And now he has stood up and told you that what he deserves is dinner. Some of the men around you laughed. Some of them are furious in a way that has very little to do with the gods, and you know exactly what it has to do with, and you cannot say the name, and neither can they. You put your token in one urn or the other. It takes a second. Nobody sees which one. And then you go home. There was a delay. The state galley had gone on the annual mission to Delos, and by ancient custom, no execution could take place while it was away. It was gone about a month. So Socrates spent his last month in prison, receiving visitors, in a city where everybody knew where he was and how to get to him and how easy it would be for him to leave. Escape was available. It was arranged and paid for, and Crito came to the cell before dawn to tell him so, and made the practical arguments that people will think your friends were too cheap to save you, that you are abandoning your sons, that you are doing your enemies' work for them. And Socrates refused, and the argument he gives in Plato is one that people have found unsatisfying for 2,500 years, and that I think is more interesting than it looks. He imagines the laws of Athens coming and standing in front of him, and asking what he thinks he is doing. They say, "We are the laws you were born under, that governed the marriage your father made, that arranged your education, under which you have lived 70 years, and in all that time you have never left this city, not even to travel, which other men do constantly. You have had more children here than anyone. You had every opportunity to go and live somewhere else, at any time, and you stayed, and by staying you accepted us. And now, the first time a decision goes against you, you are going to break us." And the important distinction is the one he then makes. He says he was wronged by men, not by the laws. The verdict was unjust. The system that produced it is the one he agreed to live under. Attacking the second, because of the first, is what he will not do. You can think that is wrong. Many people do. But it is not a man being passive. It is a man deciding that a city cannot exist if everyone reserves the right to opt out of the verdicts they lose. The last day is described in the Phaedo by a man who was there. The friends arrived early and found the chains had already been taken off. His wife Xanthippe was there with the baby, and she cried out that this was the last time they would talk to each other, and Socrates asked Crito to have someone take her home, and she was led away calling out and beating her breast. Then they talked all day, and the conversation was about whether the soul survives, and the arguments are not all good ones, and Plato has him say, at one point, that even he is not certain, and that a man should say these things to himself the way you sing a charm to keep your courage up. He bathed himself in the evening, which he explained by saying it saved the women the trouble of washing his body afterwards. When the officer of the 11 came in to say it was time, the man cried. He said Socrates was the noblest and gentlest of everyone who had ever come there, and that he knew Socrates would not be angry with him personally, since he was only carrying out orders. And Socrates said he was a good man, and had been kind the whole time he had been in there. Crito wanted him to wait. It was still light. Other people had waited until well after dark, and had a meal and drank wine and said goodbye to whoever they wanted. And Socrates said that those people thought they were gaining something, and he did not think he would gain anything by drinking a little later, except looking ridiculous to himself. The man who brought it explained what to do, which was to drink it, and then walk around until the legs felt heavy, and then lie down. He drank it easily and steadily, and his friends, who had been holding themselves together, gave up. Plato says Upoludorus, who had been crying the whole time, broke out into such a howl that he broke all of them, and Socrates asked them what they were doing, and said he had sent the women away specifically to avoid this sort of thing, and that he had heard one should die in silence, and asked them to be quiet and to hold on. So they made themselves stop. He walked until his legs felt heavy, and then lay down on his back, as instructed. The man pressed his foot and asked if he could feel it, and he said no, and then his shins, and worked upwards, showing them that he was going cold and stiff. And he said that, when it reached the heart, it would be over. And when it was around his waist, he uncovered his face. He had covered it, and said the last thing he said, which is not about the soul or the state or courage. He said, Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please pay the debt, do not forget. Asclepius was the god of healing, and you sacrificed a bird to him when you recovered from an illness. People have argued about that sentence for 2,500 years, whether it means that living was the illness and he was being cured of it, or whether it is simply a man remembering, at the very end, that he owed somebody something and did not want to leave it unsettled. Crito said he would, and asked if there was anything else, and there was no answer. That is where I want to stop, but you should know what came after, because it is not a ruin. Athens rebuilt the long walls within about a decade, funded partly by Persia, which had switched sides again because Sparta had become the problem. Within 20 years, it had assembled a second league and was a major naval power again. Within 30, it had allies and money and a fleet, and the 4th century in Athens produced the greatest orators, the largest theatre, Plato's Academy, and Aristotle. The democracy ran for another 80 years, and it did not end from within. It ended in 322, when Macedon, having beaten the Greek cities at Chaeronea, imposed a property qualification for citizenship and put a garrison in the port, and the assembly of everyone became the assembly of the men with enough money. So Athens was not destroyed in 404, and it was not destroyed in 399. What ended was something less visible, and the men who lived through it wrote about it constantly for the next 50 years. The belief. Every important Athenian writer of the 4th century is, in some way, writing about a failure. Plato spends his life arguing that a city governed by the votes of ordinary people will always kill the best man in it. Xenophon leaves and goes and fights for a Persian prince, and then admires Sparta. Socrates spends 60 years urging the Greeks to stop this and unite, and is ignored. None of them can leave it alone, because they all watched the same thing happen. They watched a city that had been told at a funeral in the first winter of a war that it was the school of Greece, that it loved beauty without extravagance and knowledge without softness, that it was free and generous and open. Vote, in the open, on a hillside, by a show of hands, in full daylight, with everyone present and everyone able to speak, to kill the men of Mytilene, and then not to kill the men of Melos, to sail to Sicily, to execute 6 generals who had just won a battle, and finally to put an old man to death for asking questions. Every one of those was a vote. There was no tyrant. There was nobody to blame afterwards who was not standing on that hill. That is what the 4th century could not get over. Not that Athens lost the war. Sparta lost its own supremacy inside 30 years, and nobody wrote a philosophy about it. It is that the freest people in the world, given the fullest possible say in their own affairs, argued carefully, listened to both sides, considered it, and chose those things. And that they were not monsters. They were farmers and potters and rowers who went home afterwards and had dinner. Go back to the wall coming down. The dust is drifting east on the wind, off the water. There is music playing, because somebody hired flute girls, which is an extraordinary detail when you think about it. Somebody in the middle of all this thought to organize entertainment. The men on the wall have found a rhythm, and the stones are going down into the corridor between the two walls. The corridor where the country families lived during the plague, in the heat, when they could not go home because home was burning. Some of the men working up there are old enough to have been at Pylos. One or two are old enough to have seen the Parthenon go up. And when they have finished, and the dust has settled, and the flute girls have gone home, the city is still there. The hill is still there. The theatre is still there. And next spring there will be plays in it. Everything is still there except the walls, and the ships, and the empire, and the confidence. They will get 3 of those back. Sleep well.